Tonight, we get to study God's Word, and that makes it a good time. We will be looking again here at the book of Judges. I'm going to, first of all, put on the screen some of my notes. I wanted to discuss a little bit of some of the curious things about the last book, or rather the last 5 chapters of the book. Let me tinker here with the, okay, got it over there where I can see my screen. So do you see my notes, Judges 17 to 21? Okay, great. The last 5 chapters are curious for a number of reasons, because for the first 16 chapters, we have followed the story of one judge after another. And now all of a sudden, these 5 chapters, no judge is mentioned. Stories are recorded, 2 basic stories, the one about this man named Micah and the idolatry that began to spread, the Levite that he hired, and anyhow then taken by the tribe of Dan. And then the last 3 chapters tell of the story of the Levite traveling and spending the night at Gibeah, the horrible story of what happened to his concubine, and the events that led to a civil war where the tribe of Benjamin was almost snuffed out from the tribes of Israel. So these stories do not seem to follow the pattern of what we have seen before, where it was a never-ending story, it seemed, of Israel descending into sin, paying a price, being punished, being oppressed. And then from their pain, they would cry out to God. And then God would lift up a deliverer here or there, different areas, different places in the tribes of Israel. So I want to scroll on up and I've asked the question here, why are these 5 chapters what it seems to be out of chronological order? And I've got 4 suggestions here. Now we'll get to Judges 18, and those early verses relate the story that the Danites, the tribe of Dan, either had not, maybe they hadn't even had the casting of lots yet. You remember how from late in Joshua that was done, and I think it says in Joshua somewhere around chapter 19 or 20 that the 7th lot fell on Dan. And so then it describes their inheritance, but it seems like that they had not fully received it or had not occupied it. And we really aren't told the reasons why the Danites decided they wanted to go up all the way up to the far extremity in the north. And they attacked and actually besieged and conquered the city that was called Laish. And of course, we see the pattern where the Danites, wherever they went, they would rename things after their forefather Dan. So that's where we come up with the city of Dan, which was the far northern extremity of the country. So this would seem to indicate that the story here of the Levites, the idolatry, the Danites, may well have taken place early in the era of the Judges, rather than by being listed late in this book. It would seem to indicate that it was late in the era. But these 5 are probably out of chronological order. So then, secondly, it mentions the name of this priest. Point number 2 there in chapter 18, verse 30, and again, we'll get to that shortly. This priest who was officiating in this, it was called a shrine in Dan, is named Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Manasseh. And commentaries I've looked at, the Bible reading program or the Bible commentary also points out that this extra kind of our equivalent of our letter N as in Nancy, there is this smaller noon consonant that is there in the manuscripts. And then the scribes kept repeating that. And when you have the MSH and then you have this N added in there, they were translating it as Manasseh, and probably it should have been Moses. And we know from early in the book of Exodus that Moses had two sons. One was named Gershom. And so likely this Jonathan is a grandson of Moses. And, or let's see, the great grandson, I should have put, of Moses, which again would date it, that event, early in the time of the Judges, not near the end of the era. So then again, we'll see this as we get there, but in chapter 20, we have reference made to Phinehas. Now, we will remember the name Phinehas. He was the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron. Phinehas was serving as high priest in this story in Judges 20. And, if he was a grandson of Aaron, and we do find him in Numbers 25 taking the action where the plague was spreading after the fornication, the adultery with the Moabitess women. So there's no way he would be living late in a period in era of the Judges that lasted for over 300 years. So this would seem to indicate that these stories at the end actually happened earlier. And then point number 4, the civil war that ensued against Benjamin so devastated the tribe, as you'll recall, only 600 men survived. The women and all the others, the women who had known a man, in that sense, been intimate with a man, they were all killed. So only 600 men. And yet, when we get a little further into the time in Israel when they had a king, and then the division of the kingdom into the house of Israel and the house of Judah, it mentions in one place that Benjamin provided a fighting force of 180,000 men. So if this story took place late in the era of the Judges and there were only 600 men and they were starting all over as a tribe to reproduce, they needed a lot more time than that. Where if it had been an event 300 years even before then, when the year of the Judges began, then there would have been enough time for the tribe to multiply. So anyhow, these two stories from early in the era of the Judges were likely added by the author to demonstrate how quickly Israel drifted away from God. And then the cycles of sin and oppression and repentance and deliverance began. But as the book ends, it says they reached the point where there was no king and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. All right, I'm going to take the notes down. I want to share now a map. So do you see the map there on the screen? Okay, great. This is another map that I found from the one that was in the Bible commentary that we looked at before. But right over here where I was able to use and just make kind of a rectangle here around the name Dan. Dan had this long kind of strange curved territory. They were next to Judah. Last time we looked at Samson's life and some of the events that happened there in Dan and in Judah and the tribe, or rather the cities like Gaza and Eshtaol and Ashdod of the Philistines. For whatever reason, the Danites wanted more territory. They went and they traveled up and they came to this far northern area of Naphtali and the eastern half tribe of Manasseh. And they besieged and conquered the city of Laish, 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 and renamed it Dan. Now, in the book of Judges, and then thereafter, we run into this phrase that the tribes of Israel went from Dan, and that was used to denote the far northern reaches, down to Beersheba, and that was in the territory of Judah. Beersheba, the seven wells is what it means, and it was in the far south. So that was the territory of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba. So let me take that map down. And now I'm going to put up the scriptures. So do you see the scriptures there on the screen? All right, thank you very much. Let's go now to chapter 17. And this chapter deals with the idolatry of a man whose name was Micah. It would appear that this man Micah, and then his mother, who had all the silver, maybe early on they didn't really intend what they were doing to lead to an open departure from God, an open rebellion, and open idolatry. But it just, a lot of times it just is by increments, by baby steps. And it began moving in that direction. And so here's Micah, verse 2, there is a sum of 1,100 shekels of silver, a sizable amount. And verse 3, the mother, when he returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother said, I had wholly dedicated the silver from my hand to the Lord for my son to make a carved image and a molded image. Now, therefore, I will return it to you. So it goes on then in verse 4 how he uses some of the silver for the engraving, for the molding, casting of this carved image and molded image. We aren't really given a full description of what they were. Verse 5 mentions this shrine that he built there in his house. Now, again, these are in the mountains of Ephraim, so from Jerusalem, and in that was the area that became the central center of worship. But at this time, they were way up north, and things were rather unsettled, and it seems like he just wanted something there in his own house to begin worshiping God. But again, this concept of idols, household idols, are mentioned in verse 5. Marginal note, the teraphim. You may remember that when Rebekah was brought from Mesopotamia back to marry Isaac, that she had brought some teraphim with her. So, and then in verse 6, this statement is made more than once in this book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So very quickly after the death of Joshua and some of the other elders, the country began to go downhill. In verse 7, there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah. He was a Levite. Okay, now don't let that confuse you. The Levites, remember, were given no inheritance. They were dispersed throughout all of the tribes, and they had duties far and wide. It was a time, if this was early in the era of the Judges, the occupation of the land was taking place, and there are a lot of things were rather unsettled, and frankly, we may have had some Levites who were just out of work. So he was staying there, and the man departed from Bethlehem to stay wherever he could find a place. So if he's down in Judah, in Bethlehem, he's going to go above through Benjamin and on up into Ephraim, which is what he does. And he comes to this Micah in the mountains of Ephraim. And in verse 9, latter part, he tells Micah, I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah. I'm on my way to find a place to stay. So Micah asks him to stay there. He wanted to hire this young Levite to lead the worship of God from his house, and just to be there as a counselor, as an advisor, someone they can consult with. So, verse 10, dwell with me, be a father and a priest. And he's going to give him so much silver per year, suit of clothes, and he's going to pay for his room and board. So the Levite went in. And verse 11, the Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became like one of his sons to him. So Micah consecrated the Levite. The young man became his priest. Now, one thing we aren't told, he is a Levite, but we are not told whether he was of the lineage of Aaron. Only those of the line of Aaron were to be priests in chapter 18. All right. So chapter 17, we see the beginnings of, and a word you should be familiar with is syncretism. Syncretism, syncretism. Syncretism is a blending of paganism, a blending of pagan practices with the worship of the true God. And we are seeing somewhat of a beginning of that taking place here, although it had been around long before. So in chapter 18, we find the tribe of Dan comes along, and they are out looking for more territory, and they happen to come across this man, Micah, as they are traveling. And 5 men go as spies, and they find out that Micah has this young Levite there serving in somewhat of a priestly role. And so they, of course, were excited about that, and yet their motive was they want to steal him away. So the early verses cover that. Verse 7, these men, these spies sent from Dan, went on up to Laish, which is a city that became the city of Dan. And they saw the people who were there, how they dwelt safely in the matter of the Sidonians, quiet and secure. There were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything. They were far from the Sidonians, and they had no ties with anyone. So here they come, they find Laish. Obviously, the tribes of Naphtali and the eastern part of Manasseh have not occupied and conquered that area yet. So these probably Phoenician peoples, that's the assumption we would make when you hear someone connected with Sidon. And they decide it's easy pickings. We can come back and we can take over. So in verse 8, they go back, they make their report back to the Danites. They tell them what they see, and that, the end of verse 10, for God has given it into your hands, a place where there is no lack of anything that is on the earth. So verse 11, the 600 men of the family of the Danites went from there, from Zorah and Eshtaol. Remember how the stories of Samson, a lot of times it would say he began working there between Zorah and Eshtaol, armed with weapons of war. They went and encamped in Kirjath-jearim in Judah. They call the place Mahana Dan. That's the camp of Dan, a place where they just stopped and camped. And they passed from there to the mountains of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. The 5 men who had been the spies said, this is what's there at Micah's house. There's a priest, there are idols. And so they decided to go and take it. Verse 16, the 600 armed men with their weapons of war, who were of the children of Dan, stood by the entrance of the gate. And verse 17, they went in, they took the carved image, the ephod, the household idols, the molded image, and they took them with them. I didn't mention the ephod a while ago. That was probably Micah's copy of what the high priest wore. He had a vest, and it was called an ephod. And so he had built one of those or sewn one of those as well. All right, so then Micah and his people find out what has taken place. So they go and they want to know what's taking place. So then they realize, we've got a sizable force here who are armed, ready for war, and so the end of this chapter is they turn and go back home. Last sentence there, Micah saw they were too strong for him, so he just turned and went back home. And then the latter verses of chapter 18 describe how they went, and they went up to this area of Laish, and they struck them with the edge of the sword, burned the city, and then they, verse 29, they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father. Now, you'll remember from probably our booklets across the decades that the church has had on the United States and Britain in prophecy, that Dan, I believe it was Genesis 49, it mentions Dan is like a serpent's trail. Wherever Dan migrated, he tended to name things after their forefather, Dan. So therefore, in parts of Europe, you have the Danube, you have the Dnieper, you have various, you have Denmark, and so different clues as far as where they traveled. So they set up, let's see, verse 30, the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image. Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, again, likely Moses. Yeah, the Septuagint, the Vulgate both have Moses here as their translation. And his sons were the priests to the tribe of Dan to this day. Now, what's the problem there? Moses was the brother of Aaron, but God established the priests as to come through Aaron's line, not Moses's line. But they're drifting far from God very, very quickly. Okay, so that's largely the first story that we have, and now we go to this second one, and that is just a horrendous event that took place. And chapter 19 tells us the story of the Levite that's traveling and his concubine and what happened. There was a brutal rape that actually killed the woman. The body was cut into pieces, sent throughout the tribes, and the armies of Israel came, and the tribe of Benjamin was almost exterminated. At least that's where it ended. So the early verses, she's playing the harlot, and she went down to her father's house in Bethlehem and was there 4 months. The husband goes back, trying to bring back his wife. And the father-in-law, he is detaining him and delaying, and he stayed 3 days. We'll stay some more, and you'll remember that story. I think there are two factors in looking at this chapter, two factors that are good to help us understand. One is cultural, and the second is historical. The cultural point is that the culture of that day required proper treatment of guests, and that certainly included travelers moving through. Life was difficult, life was tough. There was not the local Comfort Inn or Econo Lodge. Sometimes there were places to stay, but the cultural requirement of that day was that if someone was traveling through, they were to welcome that party into their home, take care of their needs, provide for their comfort, their food, their lodging, and even well, remember how Abraham, he was camping. Much of his life was camping, though. He was there in the plains of Mamre, and then the event where the God of the Old Testament and the two angels came, and he hurried to kill the fatted calf, and Sarah was baking bread, and so it was a part of the culture. So what happens to this Levite and those with his party, the servant and all, is just unthinkable in that day and age. Now, the other side of that is historical, because there are parts of this story that have to remind us of an earlier time. There was a time when that God of the Old Testament and the two angels went to the tent of Abraham. The two angels kept going, though, and they went down to Sodom to see if the things they had heard were really true. And that led to the destruction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboam. But when the angels were in Sodom, remember what happened. The men of the city surrounded the house, and they wanted the two men so they could know them. The polite King James and New King James word for being sexually intimate with them. These were men wanting men. And we're going to see some of the same things here as the story unfolds. So let's see. Let me skip part of this because the father-in-law is delaying their departure. And when they did leave, verse 10, they departed. It was late. I think it's also good to point out here, they came opposite Jebus. Now, that was the earlier name by which we know the city of Jerusalem. With him were the two saddled donkeys. His concubine was with him. They were near Jebus. The day was far spent. The servant said to his master, "Come, please, let us turn aside into the city of the Jebusites and lodge in it." But verse 12, his master said, "We will not turn aside into a city of foreigners." Now, again, remember from Israelite history, it wasn't until the time of King David that there were those forces that actually, I think it was Joab who found the way to get up and into the city. It was a long time before the city of Jebus was going to fall and actually then become a part of the tribe of the territory of Benjamin. So at this time, they were foreigners. The Jebusites were still there, and this man was not going to go there. So verse 13, the servant says, "Well, let's go to Gibeah or Ramah." And, as it turns out, they end up at the city of Gibeah, some 6-7 miles north of Jerusalem. And the latter part of verse 15, they went in, sat down in the open square of the city. See, that's normally where a traveler would go, and then someone would come and check on them and welcome them to their own home. But it says no one would take them into his house to spend the night. And then verse 16, an old man came in from working his field, and he saw the traveler. And he began asking questions, and then he insisted that you come, verse 20, peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. See, this is what somebody else in the city should have done. Do not spend the night in the open square. You see, this man lived there. He knew what conditions were like. So he brought him into his house, fed the donkeys, washed their feet, gave them food, he gave them drink. Then the sad part of the story takes place. As verse 22, as they were enjoying themselves, certain men of the city perverted men surrounded the city. Let's see, the marginal note, I think it says sons of Belial. Yes, just the worthless ones. Beat on the door, bring out the man who came to your house that we may know him carnally. So again, this is the historical connection back to Sodom, and they all knew and had grown up, heard the story over and over of how God had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And so again, strange things happen here. The master of the house went out to them. This man is, under my protection. Don't commit this outrage. But in verse 24, he offers his own daughter, and he offers the man's concubine, and do to them wherever you will. I mean, this is sad to see how corrupted this man's thinking had become. But verse 25, the men would not heed him. So he took the concubine, brought her out to them. They knew her and abused her all night till morning. Anyhow, the story unfolds where she finally got back to the door of the house and fell down. So then, verse 27, the master rose in the morning, opened the doors. Here's his concubine. He tells her, get up, let's be going. And yet there was no answer. She was dead. She was dead. And so verse 29, that's where they divided her body into pieces and sent it to the tribes and told them what happened. That verse 30, no such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel went up or came up out of the land of Egypt to this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up. So that ends chapter 19, and in chapter 20 we have the civil war, the 11 tribes against the tribe of Benjamin. And so 20 verse 1, so all the children of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, as well as the land of Gilead. That's the Golan Heights, the area over on the eastern side of the Jordan. And they all gathered together as one before the Lord at Mizpah. And so they conferred. Verse 2, they have 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. And the Levite is there telling them this is what happened. Let's drop on down here. Verse 8, all the people arose as one, saying, none of us will go to his tent, nor will any go back to his house. But now this thing which we will do to Gibeah, we will go up against it by lot. We will take 10 men out of every 100. And anyhow, I won't go through all of this. And so first of all, verse 12, they sent emissaries to the tribe of Benjamin, asking, what is this wickedness? And deliver up the men. It could have all been settled right there. It was a reasonable request. Give us the guilty parties who abused this woman all night long. And then they would have done to them what the law required. And yet, anyhow, verse 14, instead, the children of Benjamin gathered together from the cities of Gibeah to go to battle against the children of Israel. Gives their numbers as 26,000 plus another 700 from the city of Gibeah itself. It mentions in verse 16 there were 700 who were left-handed, who could sling a stone at a hair's breadth and not miss. So we're going to have a battle, and it's not going to be nice. And the Bible commentary pointed out a parallel perhaps to the American Civil War. Some of those earliest battles, especially, a far smaller, but very battle-hardened Southern force would overrun and be victorious over far greater Union armies. until a certain tide came, and then the tide turned there in the first week of July in 1863, and the upper hand went to the north. Anyhow, back to Benjamin. So we actually had kind of a process where, let's see. Oh, that's I skipped over verse 18. That's where they inquired of God, and he said Judah goes first. But Judah went, and 22,000 were cut down, were killed that day. So the early battle went to the Benjamites. And then do we go up again? Verse 24. Children of Israel approached the children of Benjamin on the second day. And this time they cut down, the Benjamites cut down 18,000 of the Israelites. So then in verse 26, all of Israel went to the house of God and wept. They sat before the Lord and fasted that day until evening. Burnt offerings, peace offerings. Here, verse 27 mentions Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, stood before it those days. So again, there's no way that this could be a story from the end of the period of the Judges, because this man's a grandson of Aaron. And so he tells them, God says, go up, tomorrow I'll deliver them into your hand. So the story takes place and the battle ensues, and they attack the city, and then they kind of feign retreat. The Benjamites charge after them, but then another force went to the city, took the city, burned it, and then it was disastrous. Verse 35, the Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel. So again, we realize God's the one fighting this battle and giving the victory to whom he had decided. The children of Israel destroyed that day 25,100 Benjamites. They started with 26,000 plus 700. So this is almost the army is wiped out. So they fled. Let's see. Well, again, verse 47, 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness of the rock of Rimmon and stayed at the rock for 4 months. So this ends chapter 20, and again, the tribe is almost exterminated. So verse 21, we have the final chapter, and that is just Israel realizing that we're to be 12 tribes, and we just about wiped out one of the tribes. So what do we do? And so verse 2, chapter 21, then the people came to the house of God, remained there before God till evening. They lifted up their voices and wept bitterly, and said, the Lord God of Israel, why has this come to pass, that today there should be one tribe missing in Israel? And so, again, the next day, beseeching God, altar, burnt offerings, peace offerings, and they come up with a plan. Of course, they all take an oath that we won't give our daughters to the Benjamites to be their wives. So let's keep on down here. Oh, I don't want to skip over this. Verse 8 mentions the city Jabesh Gilead. Jabesh Gilead. Now, when it says Gilead, that's over on the eastern side, like Sea of Galilee and to the east. It's beyond the Jordan from where most of the tribes were. And they realized, when the call went out for all of the tribes to come and assemble together, they realized nobody came from this one town, Jabesh Gilead. And so that led to them going, verse 10, go strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, including the women and children. This is the thing you shall do. You shall utterly destroy every male and every woman who has known a man intimately, So they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man intimately, and they brought them to the camp at Shiloh in the land of Canaan. Now, Benjamin. Benjamin, remember, from the 12 tribes of Jacob, Benjamin was the only one who was a full-blood brother of Joseph. Those two only through Rachel. Jabesh Gilead is in the area of the eastern half of the tribe of Manasseh. And so these 400 are a very close kin, the closest that they could find, or that there would be, because they had the same lineage, and again, Benjamin and Joseph. So these 400 then are taken to the rock of Rimmon, verse 13. They went in peace, and they gave these 400 to the Benjamites, but they needed 200 more. So then they go through the process here, and there was this feast, verse 19, the yearly feast of the Lord in Shiloh, north of Bethel. And so they instructed the men of Benjamin, come there, and when the daughters go out to perform their dances, I guess it's like Sadie Hawkins' Day from the old Lil Abner comic strip. Go, and whoever you can catch is yours. So in this way, the men of Benjamin, verse 23, they took enough wives for their number from those who danced whom they caught. Then they went and returned to their inheritance, and they rebuilt the cities and dwelt in them. So the children of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family. They went out from there, every man to his inheritance. So now Benjamin is going to need time to recover as far as numbers and size. You will remember that when we're getting to the era of the kings, when that era is about to begin, God sent Samuel to Saul, and Saul's one of his reasons that you got the wrong man was, my tribe is the smallest in Israel. So Benjamin was gathering strength and size and numbers, but still they were little Benjamin, so to speak. And then in verse 25, again, the well-remembered ending. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So that's a pretty good summary to the era of the judges. Early on, after Joshua's death, you have some of the elders. You have Phinehas for a while as the high priest. And then after that, a very rapid downfall, descent into idolatry, until we get to the point where there's no king yet, and people were doing what was right in their own eyes. Now, that's, let me take this down. Seems like I had something else. No, I don't. I have put up there what I wanted to put up there. So why don't we feel free to unmute, and if you have any, as we've wrapped up Judges, if you have any thoughts or questions or comments, this would be a good time to go ahead and do that. So if anyone has any thoughts to share, please feel free.
Well, I guess I have a comment. I've noticed it's almost like it's obvious that the order of the stories is not in chronological order, and I thought is why would they do that? And it's like it seems like they would try and arrange the stories chronologically so that it makes sense. And then I realized that happens a lot in the Bible, that where they have stories out of line and they have chapters that are switched, like Daniel. Daniel does that where it's not exactly in order and it
Right.
kind of skips around. So I'm kind of thinking that my idea of how it should be wasn't the idea at the time it was written. Is the only explanation I can think of is they didn't care. They just probably had a section of about the judges, and they said, "Oh yeah, here's this part. Why don't we tack it on the end, and we'll have it all together, and that way it doesn't get lost," kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, and I appreciate that comment, Carl. It's a fascinating story, the process of the canonization of the books of the Bible, and specifically the Old Testament. There are times in the books of Samuel and Kings where it will refer to somebody's works, and the rest of his is written in the book of some book that we don't even have. And so I think in the introduction, we mentioned that most likely Samuel is the one, and he's way down the line. So certain stories, maybe some records had to be passed along to him. And it wasn't being written at the time by somebody right there on site so that we would have more of a chronological story flow. And these last 5 chapters seem like they were tacked on later just as an afterthought. But, then there was the gathering process of the various books. You had a great assembly of the great minds there in the days of Ezra, and kind of a final stamp of approval on the books of the Old Testament, with some edits even being made at different times. So it's a story. We don't have all the pieces of the puzzle as far as how the books were put together, but we're left to deal with what is, and make it work and learn from it. So fascinating story, but a lot of it we just aren't given all the pieces of the puzzle.
I got a question along those lines. Where does Ruth fit in? What time frame does Ruth fit in?
Okay, let me put the scriptures back up here. Ruth, of course, follows right just immediately thereafter. And yet at the end of the book, pardon me while I scroll, we have the descendants. Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife. Well, let's just go down the last verses here. Salmon, a lot of commentators feel, and I would agree, that I believe Salmon was one of the 2 spies that Joshua sent in to spy out the city of Jericho. Salmon through Ruth, Salmon through Rahab, begot Boaz. So Boaz is half Jew, half Canaanite. Boaz is the one we run into here in the book of Ruth. He marries Ruth. Boaz and Ruth bear a son, Obed. Obed then is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. So by working backward, we would realize the story in the book of Ruth would have had to have been later, a later time in the era of the judges, because she actually is Ruth. The key character here is going to be the great grandmother of David. So if you go back, 20, 30 years as far as each generation, then if David is reigning somewhere around 1000 BC as king, then 4 generations back, it would be in the latter part of the book of Judges for this story of Ruth to have taken place.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. So it is situated more or less in a better better reasonable order in the Bible.
Likely, yeah, very likely. Um, and actually, the book of Ruth gives us a little glimmer or glimpse into the fact that there actually were some people. I mean, Boaz is nothing but a completely honorable man who is, he goes out there at the beginning of the day and blesses all the laborers and a very godly man. Then with how it turns out he was a near kinsman, not the nearest, but the one closest in line, passed on the opportunity to marry and to take the land or take the property. And so Boaz did that, and God bless that.
Thank you.
Next time, we're going to start the book of Acts. Let's go to the book of Acts and start surveying that story of Christian living. The church begins, and the church begins to do what God told them to do: preach the gospel and baptize and go to all the world. So, fascinating book, and it's also a book about our own roots spiritually, so where we came from. And it's always good to read the stories of those who went before. So many lessons from the book of Ruth or book of Acts can inspire us to get back in the struggle and get up when we get run over and get back in the job.